Dad shouted, "You're ungrateful. Get out and never come back." So I left without a word. Weeks later, Mom texted, "Why haven't you paid the utilities?" I replied, "Oh, I thought I wasn't welcome," and then my phone blew up with 17 missed calls. I, 24M, never thought a single argument would destroy everything I'd built with my family. But sometimes the truth hits you like a freight train when you least expect it. The utilities bill arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I remember staring at the envelope with that familiar sinking feeling. 3 months behind on electricity, 2 months on gas, and the water company had already sent their final notice. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with that same defeated expression he'd worn for weeks since losing his job at the manufacturing plant. I'd been covering these bills for 8 months straight, ever since Dad got laid off and Mom's part-time retail job barely covered groceries. My software engineering salary wasn't huge, but it was steady, and family comes first. At least, that's what I believed until everything fell apart. The conversation started innocently enough. Dad mentioned something about the neighbor's new car, how some people just had it easy in life. I could hear the bitterness in his voice, the way unemployment had slowly eaten away at his pride. Mom chimed in from the living room, talking about how her coworker's son had just bought a house at 25. That's when I made my mistake. I suggested maybe it was time for Dad to consider retraining programs or look into different industries. The job market was tough, but there were opportunities if you knew where to look. I even offered to help him set up profiles on job sites, maybe brush up his resume. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's face went red, and I could see that vein in his forehead that always appeared when he was about to explode. He told me I had no idea what it was like to be his age and looking for work, that I was just a kid who'd gotten lucky with computers and thought I knew everything about the real world. I tried to backtrack, explaining that I was only trying to help, that I understood how frustrating his situation must be. But he was already spiraling into that place where logic couldn't reach him anymore. He started listing everything wrong with my generation, how we were entitled and thought success came easy, how I lived under his roof and ate his food and had the nerve to lecture him about finding work. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been paying for that roof and that food for months, but pointing that out would only make things worse. Mom tried to mediate, suggesting we all calm down and talk this through like adults. But Dad was beyond reasoning now. He stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the floor with that awful sound that made my teeth hurt. Then came the words that would change everything. He shouted that I was ungrateful, that I had no respect for everything he'd sacrificed for me, and that I should get out and never come back if I thought I was so much better than him. The kitchen went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and Mom's sharp intake of breath. I looked at her, hoping she'd say something, anything, to walk back what had just happened. But she just stood there, wringing her hands, caught between defending her son and supporting her husband. I could have argued, could have pointed out the financial reality of our situation, could have reminded him of every bill I'd paid and every sacrifice I'd made to keep our family afloat. But something in his eyes told me he already knew all of that, and it was exactly what was eating him alive. So I didn't say a word. I walked upstairs, packed a bag with essentials, and left through the front door while they both watched from the kitchen window. The last thing I saw was Dad's face, still red with anger, but starting to show the first hints of regret. Finding a place wasn't easy on short notice, but I managed to sublet a studio apartment from a coworker who was traveling for 3 months. It was small, barely furnished, but it was mine. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's financial problems. The first week was the hardest. I kept expecting my phone to ring, kept checking for texts that never came. I'd reach for my wallet to pay their bills automatically, then remember I didn't live there anymore. The silence from home was deafening, but I refused to be the first one to reach out. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into projects, stayed late, took on extra assignments. My manager noticed the change and commented on my improved focus. It was easier to concentrate when I wasn't constantly worrying about which utility might get shut off or whether there was enough money for groceries. By the second week, I'd started to enjoy the freedom. I could buy decent food without feeling guilty about the cost, could plan for the future without factoring in my parents' expenses. The apartment was quiet, clean, and entirely under my control. The third week brought an unexpected promotion opportunity. A senior developer position had opened up, and my recent performance had caught the attention of upper management. The interview process was intense, but I felt sharper than I had in months. Without the constant stress of family drama, my mind was clearer, more focused. I got the job, along with a 20% salary increase that would have seemed like a fortune just a month earlier. For the first time since college, I was building something purely for myself. But the silence from home continued, and despite everything, it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I found myself driving past the house sometimes, just to see if anything had changed. The lawn was getting overgrown, and I noticed Mom's car wasn't in the driveway as much. Dad's truck sat in the same spot day after day. Then came the text that changed everything. I was at my desk, working through some complex code, when my phone buzzed. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I thought she was finally reaching out to apologize, maybe to ask me to come home so we could work things out. Instead, her message was short and to the point. She wanted to know why I hadn't paid the utilities this month. The power company had called, and they needed the payment by Friday or service would be disconnected. I stared at that text for a full minute, reading it over and over, trying to process the sheer audacity of it. Not a single word about missing me, no acknowledgement of what had happened, no apology for Dad's explosion or her own silence. Just a demand for money, as if I were some kind of automated payment system that had malfunctioned. My response was simple. I told her I thought I wasn't welcome there anymore. The reaction was immediate and intense. My phone started buzzing within minutes. First Mom, then Dad, then Mom again. 17 missed calls in the span of 2 hours, followed by a barrage of texts that ranged from angry to desperate to completely unhinged. Dad's messages were particularly revealing. He wanted to know how I could be so selfish, abandoning my family when they needed me most. He reminded me of everything he'd done for me growing up, every sacrifice he'd made, every dollar he'd spent on my education. The messages got progressively more desperate as the evening wore on, culminating in a long, rambling text about how family was supposed to stick together no matter what. Mom's approach was different, but equally manipulative. She focused on the practical consequences of my absence. The mounting bills, the stress on Dad's mental health, the way the neighbors were starting to talk. She painted a picture of a family in crisis, falling apart without my financial support. But the most telling message came near midnight, when Dad finally sent something that resembled an apology. He acknowledged that he'd said things in anger, that he'd been dealing with his own frustrations and taken them out on me unfairly. He asked me to come home so we could talk things through like adults. I almost responded immediately, almost packed my bag and drove over there to have the conversation we should have had weeks ago. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way his apology focused more on his own pain than on the damage he'd caused. Maybe it was the fact that it had taken a financial crisis to prompt any outreach at all. Instead, I turned off my phone and went to bed. Update 1. The next morning brought a new development. I arrived at work to find Dad sitting in the parking lot, leaning against his truck with the defeated posture of a man who'd run out of options. He looked older than I remembered, worn down by weeks of stress and unemployment. He approached me carefully, like someone trying not to spook a wild animal. His voice was quieter than usual when he asked if we could talk, just for a few minutes, man to man. We found a bench outside the building, and for the first time in weeks, Dad actually listened. He admitted that losing his job had hit him harder than he'd expected, that watching his 24-year-old son carry the family's financial burden had made him feel like a failure. He'd taken his frustration out on me because I represented everything he felt he'd lost: purpose, respect, the ability to provide. His apology felt more genuine this time, without the desperate edge of the late-night texts. He acknowledged that he'd been wrong to kick me out, wrong to take his anger out on someone who'd been trying to help. He asked if I'd consider coming home, not just to pay the bills, but to be family again. The conversation was long overdue, and part of me wanted to say yes immediately. But I'd learned something important during my weeks away. I'd been enabling their financial dependence for so long that none of us had recognized how unhealthy the dynamic had become. I told Dad I'd think about it, but that things would have to change if I came back. No more expecting me to cover bills without discussion. No more taking my contributions for granted. And definitely no more explosive arguments that ended with ultimatums about leaving. He agreed, seeming genuinely relieved that I was even willing to consider reconciliation. But when I got home that evening, I found Mom waiting in the parking lot of my apartment building. Her approach was less diplomatic than Dad's had been. She launched immediately into a lecture about family responsibility and how disappointed she was in my selfishness. According to Mom, I'd abandoned them in their hour of greatest need, prioritizing my own comfort over family loyalty. She wanted to know how I could sleep at night knowing they might lose their electricity or have their water shut off. She reminded me that they'd raised me, fed me, clothed me, and this was how I repaid them. The conversation grew heated quickly. I pointed out that I'd been supporting them financially for months without complaint, only to be thrown out the moment I suggested Dad take some initiative in finding work. Mom countered that Dad was doing his best, that the job market was impossible, and that I was too young to understand the realities of middle-aged unemployment. She was right about one thing. I didn't fully understand Dad's position, but I was beginning to understand my own position much better. For months, I'd been so focused on keeping the family financially stable that I'd ignored the emotional and psychological damage the arrangement was causing all of us. I told Mom I needed more time to think, that I couldn't make decisions about the family's future under pressure. She left frustrated, but I felt clearer about the situation than I had since this whole mess started. Update 2. 3 days later, the power got shut off. Mom's text was short and bitter. The electric company had followed through on their threat, and the house was now dark. She wanted to know if I was satisfied with the consequences of my stubbornness. The guilt hit harder than I'd expected. Despite everything that had happened, despite the manipulation and the demands, these were still my parents. The thought of them sitting in a dark house, unable to cook dinner or keep food fresh, made my stomach turn. I called the electric company directly and paid the overdue balance, plus the reconnection fee. The customer service representative was understanding when I explained the situation and promised the power would be restored by evening. But I didn't tell my parents I'd made the payment. Instead, I drove to the house that evening and parked across the street, waiting to see the lights come back on. When they did, I watched Dad's silhouette move through the kitchen, probably checking every switch to make sure everything was working. Mom appeared in the front window a few minutes later, looking out at the street with a confused expression. They'd probably spent the day expecting continued darkness, maybe making plans to stay with relatives or friends. The sudden restoration of power would have been a mystery. I drove home feeling conflicted. I'd solved their immediate problem, but I hadn't addressed the underlying issues that had caused our family crisis. If anything, I'd enabled the cycle of financial dependence that had gotten us into trouble in the first place. The next morning brought another text from Mom, asking if I'd paid the electric bill. When I confirmed that I had, her response was immediate. She wanted to know why I'd helped with utilities but was still refusing to come home. Her question highlighted the complexity of our situation. I could provide financial support from a distance, solving their practical problems without subjecting myself to the emotional volatility that had driven me away. But that wasn't what they wanted, and I was beginning to realize it wasn't what I wanted either. Family relationships can't be reduced to financial transactions. The money had been a symptom, not the cause, of our deeper problems. Dad's unemployment crisis had exposed fault lines in our family dynamic that went back years. His struggle with pride and purpose, Mom's tendency to avoid conflict until it exploded, and my own pattern of trying to solve emotional problems with practical solutions. I decided it was time for a different approach. I called Dad and asked him to meet me for coffee, somewhere neutral where we could have an honest conversation without the weight of family history pressing down on us. He agreed immediately, and I could hear the hope in his voice. The coffee shop was busy enough to provide background noise, but quiet enough for serious conversation. Dad looked better than he had in the parking lot a few days earlier, less desperate, though still carrying the weight of months of unemployment. I started by acknowledging what I'd learned during our separation, that my financial support, while helpful, had created an unhealthy dynamic where everyone's problems became my responsibility. Dad had felt diminished by accepting help from his son, while I'd felt trapped by expectations I'd never explicitly agreed to carry. Dad listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as I described the stress and resentment that had built up over months of carrying the family's financial burden. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee with the intense focus of someone organizing difficult thoughts. His response surprised me. He admitted that he'd known the situation was unsustainable, that depending on me financially had made him feel like a failure as a father and provider. He'd lashed out not because he was ungrateful, but because every bill I paid was a reminder of his own inability to fulfill what he saw as his primary role in the family. We talked for 2 hours, covering ground we should have explored months earlier. Dad revealed that he'd actually been attending job training programs for the past month, learning new skills in HVAC repair and maintenance. He hadn't mentioned it because he was afraid of raising hopes that might be dashed again. He'd also been seeing a counselor through a free program at the unemployment office, working through the depression and anxiety that had followed his layoff. The counseling had helped him understand how his pride had prevented him from accepting help gracefully, and how his anger had been misdirected at the people trying to support him. The conversation felt like the beginning of something healthier, but I knew we couldn't rebuild our relationship overnight. Trust, once broken, takes time and consistent effort to repair. Update 3. I agreed to move back home, but with conditions that would protect both of us from falling back into the same destructive patterns. First, we'd establish a clear household budget that accounted for everyone's contributions and expenses. Dad would apply for every available assistance program while continuing his job training. Mom would look into increasing her hours at work or finding additional part-time employment. And I would contribute a specific, sustainable amount each month rather than covering whatever shortfalls arose. Second, we'd have weekly family meetings to discuss financial status and any concerns before they exploded into arguments. Communication had been our biggest failure, and we couldn't afford to repeat that mistake. Third, Dad would continue his counseling, and we'd all consider family therapy if needed. The emotional damage from months of stress and conflict wouldn't heal automatically just because I'd moved back home. The transition wasn't seamless. Old habits die hard, and there were moments when I felt the familiar pressure to solve everyone's problems with my checkbook. But the weekly meetings helped us catch these patterns before they became destructive. Dad's job training paid off sooner than expected. Within 6 weeks of my return, he'd completed his HVAC certification and found steady work with a local contractor. The pay wasn't as high as his previous job, but it was consistent, and more importantly, it restored his sense of purpose and pride. Mom increased her hours at the retail store and picked up weekend shifts at a local catering company. The extra income wasn't substantial, but it showed her commitment to the family's financial stability and reduced the pressure on everyone else. The dynamic in the house gradually shifted from crisis management to something that felt more like partnership. Dad started cooking dinner most nights, taking pride in providing for the family in a different way than before. Mom handled the household budget with the attention to detail she'd always brought to her part-time jobs. And I learned to set boundaries without abandoning the people I cared about. I could support my family financially without sacrificing my own future or mental health. The most important change was in how we communicated about money and stress. Instead of letting resentment build until it exploded, we addressed problems early and honestly. When Dad had a slow week at work, he told us immediately rather than letting the anxiety eat at him. When I felt overwhelmed by work or family responsibilities, I spoke up rather than suffering in silence. 6 months later, our family finances had stabilized enough that I could reduce my contribution to utilities and groceries while building my own savings account. Dad's income covered most of the household expenses, and Mom's earnings handled the rest. For the first time since college, I was living with my parents by choice rather than obligation. The experience taught me that family relationships, like financial systems, require regular maintenance and honest assessment. Problems that seem insurmountable in the moment often have practical solutions if everyone involved is willing to communicate openly and share responsibility fairly. Looking back, I realized that Dad's explosion and my temporary departure were both necessary parts of reaching a healthier equilibrium. Sometimes families need to break apart a little before they can come back together in a stronger configuration. The missed calls and desperate texts that had seemed so manipulative at the time were actually signs of a family system in crisis, trying desperately to return to stability. My refusal to immediately solve their problems with money had forced everyone to confront the underlying issues we'd all been avoiding. Now, when the utilities bill arrives, Dad usually handles it himself. But sometimes he'll ask me to review the household budget or help troubleshoot a particularly expensive month. The difference is that these are conversations between adults sharing responsibility, not emergencies dumped on someone expected to have all the answers. The phrase, "family comes first," means something different to me now. It's not about sacrificing your own well-being to solve other people's problems. It's about building relationships strong enough to weather difficult times, honest enough to address problems before they become crises, and flexible enough to adapt when circumstances change.